This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Hone, and it's Wednesday, and that means it's time for another deck history video, the series where I trace prominent Magic deck archetypes from their origins all the way through to the present day. Most of the time, we look at decks that have had multi-format success over several years, or we zoom in on one really historically significant deck at one or two events, like we've done when looking at Stasis and Frostbloom decks. This time, we're sort of doing something that's in between those two, and we're looking at a deck archetype that was incredibly dominant for a couple of years, but only in Standard. As usual, I give viewers the opportunity to vote in a poll to determine the topic of this video, and I give you all an option between two decks that were really dominant in a single format. Rebels, and Energy. And Energy won a relatively close poll, and that's what we're looking at today. Energy is a mechanic that was introduced in Kaladesh, and it provided an additional expendable resource for players to use. Cards could both give and consume energy, and doing so often gave you some pretty powerful effects. Ultimately, the mechanic proved to be a little too good for Standard, as creating energy turned out to have a high enough value that many of the cards that produced it felt insanely efficient. Some of the key cards from the deck ended up getting banned, leading to the end of the utter dominance of the deck, though it didn't make them entirely extinct. Energy decks came in many shapes and sizes in Standard between 2016 and 2018, and taken collectively, Energy decks are one of the most dominant Standard decks of all time. It's right up there with decks like Caw-Blade and Devotion. In this video, we're going to cover all of the variants that had significant success at Magic's highest level of competition, starting in 2016. Two Energy decks top-aided Pro Tour Kaladesh in 2016, which, as you might have assumed, was the first Pro Tour following the release of Kaladesh. These two decks were markedly different from one another, and they would ultimately spawn some long-lasting Energy archetypes. Let's start with a look at Pierre Dagen's deck, which was an Energy control deck, largely built around Dynavolt Tower. It was essentially a spells matter deck that looked to get energy out of casting its spells, and then the tower can use 6 energy to lightning bolt stuff. Obviously, this deck is absolutely loaded up with instants and sorceries, 31 of them to be exact. In addition to getting energy out of casting those spells, the deck ran some additional cards that produced energy, including Harness Lightning, Glimmer of Genius, and Aether Hub. The Lightning could also be more powerful with extra energy, while Glimmer of Genius was a nice card draw spell that produced energy, and Aether Hub was a land that gave you energy, and it could also use energy to fix your mana. Dynavolt Tower energy decks would continue to be a thing after Pro Tour Kaladesh, though this deck's descendants aren't nearly as strong as the descendants of the other energy deck to top-8 the event, which was Matt Nass's Marvelous Teamer deck. Like Pierre's deck, this was an energy deck really built around one energy engine, in this case, Aetherworks Marvel. The Marvel produces energy anytime a permanent you control goes to the graveyard, and you can cash in 6 energy to look at the top 6 cards of your library, and then you can cast one creature from among those 6 for free. This deck's game plan was all about using the Marvel to cheat either Emrakul or Ulamog into play, and it could achieve that as early as turn 4. Both of these Eldrazi are pretty much unbeatable that early. Emrakul brings massive size, and it lets you control your opponent's next turn, which can really allow you to completely disrupt everything your opponent is trying to do. So much so that giving them an additional turn after the turn you control wasn't enough for them to recover. Ulamog, meanwhile, exiles 2 permanents, is an indestructible 10/10, and it also mills 20 cards every time it attacks. This deck produced insane amounts of energy with really efficient cards, like Attune with Aether, which could help you fix your mana while producing energy, or Aether Meltdown, a removal spell that tacked on some energy for you. Notably, the presence of both Attune with Aether and Aether Hub in energy decks would allow them to play a whole lot of colors pretty easily, and that's going to be a recurring theme. In addition, the deck ran both Glassblower's Puzzle Knot and Woodweaver's Puzzle Knot. Both of these produced energy when they entered and when they were sacrificed, and if they got sacrificed with the Marvel in play, they gave you even more energy. So, yeah. If you played a turn 1 Attune with Aether, a turn 2 Meltdown, a turn 3 Puzzle Knot, and a turn 4 Marvel, you could go and get one of those Eldrazi right away, and that wasn't even the only way to make that happen. The deck did run some card selection to help you find the powerful Marvel too. In addition to Glassblower's Puzzle Knot, there's Glintnest Crane, Contingency Plan, and Vessel of Nascency. This deck was frighteningly consistent, and its descendants would go on to be the most dominant energy deck during Kaladesh's early time in Standard. So much so that Emrakul got banned in January of 2017, But that wasn't quite enough to get rid of the deck. Let's take a look at what Aetherworks Marvel decks looked like by mid-2017 after Emrakul got banned. Obviously enough, Emrakul isn't around anymore, but it turned out just having Ulamog around was enough for this deck to power its way to an absurdly high win percentage. The deck did diversify a little bit, as it could also use all of its energy to produce a ton of Thopter tokens with Whirler Virtuoso. Notably, by this point, Aether Revolt had also been released, and that set featured another very powerful energy card in Rogue Refiner. The Refiner gave you so much for the mana, since you got a 3/2, a card, and 2 energy for only 3 mana. In June, not long after Yelko Bodewis top-8'd with this deck, Aetherworks Marvel got banned. It was just too good and too consistent, and that marked the end of one of the most dominant energy decks of them all. Notably, the Marvel is now legal in Historic, but so far it hasn't done anything in that format yet. Similarly, some versions of the deck are also played in Pioneer, but so far, not to much success. Anyway, we still have plenty more energy variants to discuss in Standard, so let's rewind to earlier in 2017 at Pro Tour Aether Revolt, where Martin Juza piloted a more aggressive version of the deck. Martin's Jund energy deck really leaned on 3 aggressive energy creatures: Greenbelt Rampager, Longtusk Cub, and Voltaic Brawler. The Rampager could produce energy for you in addition to having great stats. Longtusk Cub was a 2-mana 2/2 that gained energy anytime it hit a player, and it could spend 2 energy to get a +1/+1 counter, which could really allow it to snowball. And Voltaic Brawler was a nicely efficient 2-mana 3/2 that could consume energy to become a 4/3 with Trample when it attacked. So, with a total of 12 copies of these highly efficient energy creatures, you can see how aggressive this deck could be. Aggressive Jund energy decks would be a feature in Standard throughout 2017. One of the sweeter aggressive energy decks was the Pummeler variant, which was a lot like the Jund variant, running aggressive energy creatures like Longtusk Cub and Voltaic Brawler, but the special feature in this particular deck is Electrostatic Pummeler, which could give the deck a combo finish, not unlike an Infect or Death Shadow deck in another format. If you had enough energy and combined the Pummeler with pump effects from Uncaged Fury, Invigorated Rampage, or Blossoming Defense, you can end up doing lethal in a single swing. This version of an aggressive energy deck didn't go on to as much long-term success, but it gets my pick as the coolest of all these energy decks. There was also an aggressive Golgari energy deck that emerged in 2017. This deck was still into energy, but it also had a significant +1/+1 counter theme as a result of Winding Constrictor. The Constrictor allows you to put an extra counter on something every time you put counters on it, and this includes yourself. Energy is actually put on you as a counter, so it also generated extra energy to help power your Longtusk Cubs and things like that. The deck's most absurd plays didn't even usually involve energy though, as Constrictor plus Rishkar or Verdurous Gearhulk was absolutely absurd. The deck also used Glint Sleeve Siphoner, an efficient menace creature who could use energy to draw you more cards. Ultimately, these Golgari energy decks would go on to be the most long-lived of all the energy decks, and this is largely because it was a lot less all-in on energy, so the bans that would come in early 2018 didn't impact this deck nearly as much as it did others. By late 2017, energy decks were gradually becoming good stuff energy decks that had way too good of mana, as 4 and 5 color energy decks started to become commonplace. The deck Mike Sigris top-8'd Pro Tour Ixalan with is a good example of energy decks moving in this direction. As I mentioned earlier, mana was just way too good for energy decks between Aether Hub and Attune with Aether, and Servant of the Conduit also provided even more energy-based fixing, allowing the deck to just jam in super powerful cards in the format with very little downside. This included things like the Scarab God, Glorybringer, and Chandra Torch of Defiance. This ability to just run any super powerful card you wanted to, coupled with the general power of the energy producing and using cards, made this deck way too good. As a result, in early 2017, the Banhammer hit energy decks really hard, with Attune with Aether and Rogue Refiner both getting removed from Standard. They both just gave way too much value for the cost and had led to Standard becoming incredibly homogenous, with most decks in the format just being 4 and 5 color energy good stuff piles. This definitely wounded energy decks, taking away the utter dominance they had enjoyed for over a year, but as I indicated earlier, it wasn't enough to take them down entirely. From the time of the ban until the energy cards rotated out of Standard, Winding Constrictor energy decks became the primary form of the deck. It was a lot harder to be a 4-color deck now, but a 3-color deck was still on the table, and the deck still had its powerful Winding Constrictor +1/+1 counter-based nonsense, joined with energy creatures like Glint Sleeve Siphoner and Bristling Hydra. who provided powerful energy payoffs. From this point on, the deck usually took on the name of Constrictor, since the deck wasn't nearly as energy-centric as it had been before the ban. By the end of 2018, energy decks rotated out of Standard, and that was pretty much the end for them. They enjoyed 2 years of dominance in Standard, taking on many different forms, and they even managed to survive a couple different waves of bans that were intended to weaken them. So far, energy decks haven't really found success anywhere else, with Historic and Pioneer the only other formats where it's even gotten close. Part of the problem is that energy is a hugely parasitic mechanic. Kaladesh block is the only place you can get cards that produce or use energy, so in a format like Standard you could get by making really focused energy decks, but there just aren't enough powerful energy things going on in Magic as a whole for consistent success elsewhere. We probably need to see a return of energy as a mechanic in a future set for it to ever make a dent anywhere else. Well, that's the history of energy decks. If you want to have a say in next week's deck history topic, don't forget to vote on the community tab. If you want to make sure you catch future episodes of this series, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on the over 33 other deck history videos, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. Lastly, if you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, you can on Patreon. Thanks for watching.